Good morning everyone and welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna. We'll get started in just a few seconds. Hi Fiona. Mike, hello. So yes, welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna. If you are not familiar with me or with this series, my name is Lorna Steele and I'm the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service. This is a series that we started over a year ago, initially for school children and then broadened out to all sorts of different audiences and people. So it's really lovely to have you with us this week and every week. The Highland Archive Service, for those of you who don't know, covers the Highland area of Scotland, which covers about a third of the landmass of Scotland, a big geographical area. And we have 4 archive centres in the Highland Archive Service that allow us to cover that area as best we can. And so we have the Highland Archive Centre in Inverness, Nucleus, the Nuclear and Caithness Archives in Wick, Skye and Loch Alsh Archive Centre in Portree, and Loch Aber Archive Centre in Fort William. And together, the 4 of them make up the service. A reminder before I do anything else that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer, that High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and that there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series or to watch the Learn with Lorna series. But if you are in a position to be able to donate towards our work, it is very, very much appreciated, and thank you so much to those of you who have done that. And while I'm saying thank you to all of you who have filled out the survey so far. It's really very much appreciated. It helps us to look at what we do going forwards and to see if this series has been making a difference to people, and it's really appreciated for you to take the time to fill it out, so thank you for that. This week we are carrying on with this month's theme of landmarks and locations. So if any of you watch our 4 Facebook pages generally, then you'll, I'm sure, have been seeing that all of the pages have been putting out Facebook posts about different landmarks and locations within the relative areas. So please do go back and have a look at those. But this week we're marking a significant landmark and location in the Highlands and also marking an anniversary. It's the 275th anniversary of the Battle of Culloden tomorrow. This is a huge story, of course it is. Any kind of conflict, it doesn't come, it always has its complications surrounding it. There are a lot of intricacies in this story, and it's tied up in contemporary politics, it's tied up in religious divides going back generations. There's a lot within this story about the desire for parliamentary reform and of course power struggles, and that so much of conflict, as we know right through history, is about who's in charge and who has the power. The story of the Jacobites is also kind of further complicated by years and years of later romance and politics kind of swaying the story one way or the other. So I'm very aware that I have only half an hour to speak to you, and so what I'll do is try and give a brief overview of the Jacobite risings and the Battle of Culloden. If you're able to join us for the talk tomorrow night, I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. But if you're able if you're booked to join us on that, then that's great. It's fully booked, but we will be recording it, so you should be able to see it back afterwards if you're not able to join us on the evening. So again, as I have said sometimes in previous weeks, I won't be able to go into every single aspect of this, so please be aware that if there's a part of the conflict that I don't mention, then it's me trying to get as much of the story as I can into half an hour. So we need to understand the Battle of Culloden in context. So there is no way I could use this half an hour just to talk about the battle, because battles don't happen in isolation. They happen, of course, as part of a wider conflict and a wider story. So I thought what I would do today was spend the first half just quickly rattling through the Jacobite risings, where they came from and some key dates and points, and then spend the second half looking at the battle itself and the legacy that has come from that battle. I'm also aware that I have done a kind of overview of the Jacobites previously, although a year ago, so maybe some of you didn't join us at that point. So There is an earlier one that I've done as well if you want to have a look at that. So I could start the story at so many different points in history. We have a long history, as many countries do, of political and religious divide. And it's that political conflict and religious conflict is just so much a part of the background of this story. So you could start anywhere. You could start with Henry VIII. You could probably start quite a lot of stories with Henry VIII. But I'm going to start with what was seen as the main catalyst that caused the revolution. And terminology is important in this as well. I won't use the term rebellion, although technically it was seen as a rebellion against the government, so that the word rebellion is not totally incorrect, but it is a contentious one. Okay, so if we start with King James the 7th and 2nd, so he was the 7th King James of England, the 2nd King James of England, the 7th King James of Scotland. He was a Stuart monarch and the son of Charles I, who many of you will know as the only monarch to be beheaded. James's first wife was Anne Hyde, and she was a Protestant, and they had 2 children, Mary and Anne, who were both raised as Protestants. In 1673, after the loss of his first wife, King James went on to marry his second wife, Mary of Modena. At some point around this time, he converted to Catholicism, and this was a kind of controversial and difficult decision for him and wasn't widely known initially. Then, about 10 years later, 1685, he acceded to the throne. And I wanted to read an extract for you from a letter that we hold in our Lochaber collections from Louis Le Mat from 1685, the year that James acceded to the throne. And it says, "I have no doubt that you know the restless nature of my countrymen, particularly when they have an opportunity to cover their quarrels with the specious pretext of religion. The prince who has now acceded to the throne is active, zealous, enterprising, and bold in his enterprises, and because he has constantly suffered for his religion, he has convinced the world of his sincerity and of his interest for the Catholic religion. One of the 3 kingdoms which are submitted to him is almost entirely Catholic. Our country is less large and fertile, but there are a great number of bold men who are attached to their opinions more than I can say when they are convinced of anything." So James himself actually was reasonably open to different religions, and perhaps that was because of the suffering mentioned in that letter. He had suffered for his own religion and therefore was wary about overly persecuting anybody for religion. Things really came to a head in 1688. This was when King James the 7th and 2nd, with his second wife Mary of Modena, had a son, James. And this changed the order of succession, and that in turn gave rise to concern amongst some of the establishment and some of the Protestant population. Not all, but some, and a rise for concern about what a Catholic monarch would mean in practice. And so this led to the 1688, what's known as the Glorious Revolution. A contemporary, a way of looking at this, I think a contemporary term is that it was an invited invasion. So a group within Parliament invited William of Orange and his wife, Mary, and Mary was James's daughter, Mary, to take over the throne. And so the throne was seized, as I say, an invited invasion, so kind of a compromise between an aggressive invasion and an invitation to take over the throne. William and Mary were crowned as joint monarchs, and James fled to France, where he was recognised as the legitimate king. And again, there are so many things at play here. There is a desire for parliamentary reform. There was, to some extent, a fear that a Catholic monarch might be an absolute monarch who would believe in the divine right to rule. There were religious differences that had been simmering in the country and across the continent. There's also a lot of propaganda and sedition at work at this time. And so as James fled, risings immediately started across the British Isles. There were conflicts right across the landmass that is the British Isles, notably conflicts in Ireland, but we're going to focus on the Scottish part of it here. And so the Inverness Town Council minutes immediately record their concern that something is going to happen. And the Town Council minutes read, the council having met for regulating the affairs of the borough, taking to their consideration the great fears this place is exposed to through the incursions of the Highlanders. And this is something I've mentioned previously, I find very interesting, that they see a cultural distinction between the Highlands and the Highlanders as a certain cultural group of people. And so even within Inverness, which might be seen to be right at the centre of the Highlands, there's a feeling that the Highlanders are something other and that they are going to come out in support of King James, the exiled King James. And so they came out this is when the name Jacobites appears, so from the Latin for James, so the supporters of James. 1689, the Jacobites won the Battle of Killiecrankie, but their leader, Bonnie Dundee, Viscount Dundee, was killed. And he had been a very strategic and effective military leader. And so with the loss of Bonnie Dundee, the leadership passed to various other people, but they didn't quite have the momentum that they had had with Dundee leading them. And so there were several losses at the Battle of Dunkeld, Battle of Cromdale, and gradually the rising dissolved. In 1701, the Act of Settlement was passed, and this was a law that put into law that a Catholic couldn't hold the throne. And so that was a way of kind of putting into law and into writing something that they were concerned about. And so 1701, Act of Settlement. The next major rising happened in 1715. Various things have happened by that point. William and Mary had both died, and they had passed the throne to James. So you remember, Mary was James's daughter. They had passed the throne to her sister Anne. James, by this point, had died and has passed on the cause to his son, James, who was the baby who was born, who was kind of the catalyst for it all happening. And the countries that make up the British Isles had gone through some radical changes, including a vast, enormous loss of money in Scotland after their failed attempt to set up a trading colony in Darien. So the Scottish coffers were greatly impacted by that. And then the 1707 Union of the Crowns between Scotland and England, which had been viewed with concern by many in Scotland because it was seen by some to be an unbalanced agreement. Not by everybody. So 1707, the catalyst for that rising was the death of Queen Anne. Queen Anne died in August 1714, leaving no heirs. And so instead of the throne reverting to her half-brother James, who James's son, it went instead to George, the Elector of Hanover, who was a distant cousin who lived in Germany and was the nearest Protestant relation, because that law had been passed meaning that a Catholic couldn't take the throne. When Anne died in August 1714, again, you can see within our town council minutes an immediate fear that something is going to kick off, something's going to happen. And the Nairn Borough Council minutes say there's a meeting called, and they request that the magistrates should look to the keeping of the peace within their boundaries and presenting any disturbances that might arise out of the Queen's death. On George's accession to the throne, 102 clan chiefs and heads of clans, led by John Erskine, the Earl of Mar, wrote an address to King George I. It is a very flowery and flattering address about his accession to the throne. It's possible that this address never reached him, but for whatever reason, Mar was overlooked in a role for office, which was what he had been kind of aiming towards. And so in disappointment and frustration, Mar turned his back on the government side and turned to lead the Scottish support for the exiled King James, who by this point was kind of known as King James VIII and III, even though he never actually got that title. And in 1715 rising, the standard was raised at Braemar on the 6th of September 1715. And I wanted to read to you a letter from our Lochaber collections which records this moment, and it's written by the Earl of Mar to John Cameron, and it says, "John, Earl of Mar, Commander-in-Chief of His Majesty's forces in Scotland. These orders are in His Majesty's name, ordering and requiring you forthwith to raise all your men, friends and following, with their best arms and accoutrements, and to march them immediately to Argyllshire to join the king. Other forces and friends are there, and they are there to march from there towards Glasgow. It never stops being awesome having these documents contemporary documents to refer to. Families across the country and across the Highlands came out in support of both sides of this debate. I think there's often a vision that the Highlands were only ever Jacobite. Certainly the documents that we hold prove that there were vehement and people coming out, families and clans coming out on both sides of the debate with very strong feelings. And there were lots of skirmishes and battles in the 1715 as well, and notable events included the Battle of Preston, which was a very decisive, clear government victory, Battle of Sheriffmuir, which was an inconclusive result, but it did achieve halting the Jacobite advance. And also, there was all sorts of things happening across the Highlands, including the Siege of Inverness, in which the town was garrisoned by about 100 Jacobites. They took over the castle, they took over the toll booth, the jail, and all of these things are recorded in the town council minutes, in letters and other documents. But after the only recorded death of the Siege of Inverness, which was the death of Arthur Rose, the garrison surrendered because Arthur's half-brother Hugh threatened to reduce Inverness to ashes if the Jacobites didn't surrender. And so at that point, the garrison did surrender, and the rising sort of crumbled to an end. And it's really interesting that it was Sheriffmuir, the Battle of Sheriffmuir, the Siege of Inverness, the Battle of Preston, all of these things came to an end around about the 12th, 13th, 14th of November 1715, and the rising just collapsed. There were the result of the rising, there were all sorts of things that came out of it. Estates were forfeited, titles were forfeited. 1716, the Disarming Act was passed, which meant that people within certain areas of Scotland were not allowed to bear arms anymore. So in the Highlands, people were not allowed to bear arms. Transportation, death and imprisonment for a lot of those involved. And the construction of a huge, vast network of roads, bridges and forts across the Highlands. And this is when many of you will know the name George Wade. And this is where George Wade's roads come in. And this was entirely so that if anything happened again, the troops could move quickly through the Highlands. And there were all sorts of claims for compensation thrown at the town council, people who were hacked off about what had happened to them in the rising, with swords stolen from them and shoes stolen, and being forced to serve beer to the army who were taking over the town. The next rising, much smaller, 1719, this was when King Philip V of Spain offered his assistance to James, and he landed 300 Spaniards. They landed at Eilean, having come from Stornoway, the Isle of Lewis. They met up with local supporters at Eilean, but they were discovered by government troops, and there were 3 government warships there who discovered them, and the castle was blown up. And those mixed group of Spaniards and Highlanders fled, and then they met government troops in combat at the Battle of Glenshiel. It's interesting, a lot of these, one of these battles from the 15 is the last known battle on English soil, believed to be the last battle on English soil. The Battle of Glenshiel is the last time that foreign troops engaged in battle in Britain, and the 45, the Battle of Culloden, is generally considered to be the last battle on British soil. So there's a lot of key points here. It's a real turning point in our history for lots of different reasons. And then there was relative peace. Now, absolutely relative and absolutely uneasy peace until 1745, which I'll come on to after I've reminded you that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer, that High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and that there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series, but if you're able to donate towards us, then we are very, very grateful for that. Okay, so by 1745, the cause is now being fronted by James the 7th and 2nd's grandson, so that's the original king who fled. It's his grandson, Bonnie Prince Charlie, James's son. And he landed in Lochaber and raised the standard at Glenfinnan on the 17th of August, 1745. And this is one of the letters that we have that talk about this moment. This is sent by Bonnie Prince Charlie to Ewan Macpherson of Cluny. Being fully persuaded of your loyalty and zeal for the King's service, I think it fit to inform you that I am come into this country to assert his right, at the head of such of his faithful subjects as will engage in his quarrel. I therefore intend to set up the royal standard at Glenfinnan on Monday the 19th inst. Your appearance on that occasion would be very useful, but if not practicable, I expect you to join me as soon as possible. You will always find me ready to give you marks of my friendship. And that's signed by Charles PR, so Charles the Prince Regent. And the first real confrontation of the 45 was the Battle of Gladsmuir, or the Battle of Prestonpans, and that was a Jacobite victory, and we have within our collections documents that detail that battle and also a plan of the battle. If you're joining me tomorrow night, then you'll see I've included some of those images in my talk tomorrow night, but like I say, that will be recorded if you don't catch it live. The army then moved forward, moved down following that battle, moved south to Derby, where they arrived in December 1745. And this is the orders that we hold from Bonnie Prince Charlie instructing his followers to march south. You are hereby authorised to repair forthwith to England, and there to notify my friends, and particularly those in the north and the northeast, the wonderful success with which it has hitherto pleased God to favour my endeavours for their deliverance. Let them know it is my full intention in a few days to move towards them, and that they will be inexcusable before God and man if they do not do all in their power to assist and support me in my undertaking. I think possibly I have read that before because it's such a striking document, such a powerful moment of going, I'm coming, and this is your moment. You have to support me. If you don't support me, you are very much in the wrong. Okay, so they marched towards Derby, but that wave of support that they had expected didn't quite materialise, and they had been expecting a range of reinforcements to come from France, and those didn't arrive. And so after some deliberation and debate, rather than marching on to London, which had been the original plan, they turned back north. It's interesting, it's a literal turning point, but it's also an absolutely key turning point in the risings and in the Jacobite cause, and a lot of historians and experts, which I am not, but a lot of them believe that decision was a very, very key part in what happened next. And so they returned to the Highlands with the aim of meeting the Duke of Cumberland's army to prevent him from taking Inverness. On their way back north, they won the Battle of Falkirk in January, but they won it and then they just carried on moving rather than really capitalising on that. And the confrontation between the Duke of Cumberland, who was King George II's son, and Bonnie Prince Charlie, who were both around 25, 26 at the time that they were leading these armies, happened just outside Inverness on the 16th of April, 1746. Cumberland's army had marched from Aberdeen. They were well rested, they were well fed. On the 15th of April, so today, 275 years ago today, they had camped at Nairn. It was Cumberland's birthday, so they had marked that with extra rations. They had had a lot of food, a lot of drink, and a lot of rest. The Jacobite army had marched back from the south and had arrived exhausted. They attempted a surprise night attack on the Hanoverian army, and that potentially, Culloden battlefield have said that they think that there was every chance that would have succeeded if they had done a night attack on the Hanoverian army. Then maybe they would have had the edge over them. But what happened was they were simply so exhausted on their night march to try this surprise attack that they were so exhausted that they couldn't march fast enough, and so they didn't make it to the army and they had to turn back. And what happened, of course, was rather than sneaking up on their enemy and attacking them, all they did was spend hours marching and further exhausting themselves ahead of a conflict, and it was a complete disaster from the Jacobite perspective. And so it came to battle. And there was debate about the location for the battle, what would be the best location. And in the end, Bonnie Prince Charlie thought that they should fight where they were, which was on Culloden Moor. It wasn't the preferred choice of all the leaders. It wasn't a terrible location, but it certainly wasn't ideal for the Highland charge, which was their preferred way of fighting. And as many of you will know, I'm sure, the battle was an absolute disaster for the Jacobites. It was very short and sharp. It took around about an hour, so a very, very short battle. Around about 1,300 men were killed in about an hour. And it's believed that of that 1,300, an estimated over 1,000 were Jacobite soldiers. So a very decisive victory for the Hanoverian, or the government forces. It was a very brutal and bloody battle, and it was a final end to the Rising. And it, as I mentioned, generally seen as the final battle on British soil. And there were widespread repercussions after this. So I mentioned some of the things that had happened after the 1689 Rising and the 1715 Rising. There had been very severe consequences after those, but after the 45, those consequences were far harder and administered far more severely. So estates and titles were forfeited again. Interesting that following the earlier risings, a lot of families had decided to put one son on either side just in case, because they didn't know which way it would go, and that way they would still have an argument for keeping their title or their estates. But there were a lot of forfeitures of estates. Persecution of Catholics became more widespread. Executions of those who had taken part, including the infamous Lord Lovat, who I've mentioned before. I'll do a separate talk on Lord Lovat. Extension and far stronger enforcing of the Disarming Act, which now included a section called the Dress Act, which meant that it was prohibited to wear tartan or Highland dress. That carried with it a 6-month prison sentence, and if you were caught in a second time, then transportation. And one of the other consequences was the deconstruction of the clan system. The aim being to prevent this being able to happen again. Now, I've mentioned, certainly in this talk and in other talks, that this is not an English-Scottish conflict. I think we're getting to the point now that message is getting out there, but it's not an English-Scottish conflict. But there is an element of the system that operated in the Highlands that made it perhaps more. It made it easier to operate within that clan structure for a rising to happen. And so one of the things that was done after the rising was to try and deconstruct that. And it was incredibly effective. All of these brutal and awful things that happened after the Jacobite risings were very effective, because the Jacobite claim all but disappeared. And I wanted to read to you an extract, and forgive me if I've read this before, I find it quite striking. This is written by an English Jacobite after the Battle of Culloden, and he's writing his speech before he's executed. And it reads, "After the Battle of Culloden, I had the misfortune to fall into the hands of the most ungenerous enemy that I believe ever assumed the name of a soldier. I mean the pretended Duke of Cumberland, and those under his command, whose inhumanity exceeds everything I could ever have imagined in a country where the bare mention of God is allowed. I was put into one of the Scotch kirks together with a great number of wounded prisoners who were stripped naked and then left to die of their wounds." So there is no doubt at all that a lot of what happened after Culloden was particularly brutal. And the battle has had an absolutely huge legacy. It has a legacy in the culture and structure of the Highlands, in the fact that 1701 Act of Settlement that I mentioned is been amended. You may recall it being in the news when Prince William was expecting his first child, that the Act of Settlement was altered so that if he had had a daughter first, she could take the throne. But it's still never been repealed, and therefore it still remains illegal for the monarch of the United Kingdom to be a Catholic. It's resulted in this romantic and dramatic image of the Highlands, and a lot of that is a later construct. But ballads and paintings and stories started to be born immediately during and after the Jacobite risings. So to some extent this is a battle that's 1 hour long, but it's part of a much longer picture of religious conflict and turmoil, political reform, so many intricacies and details. And as I say, that 1 hour and those risings in general have been responsible for a very key part of Scottish history, British history, and its shadow has lain long, I think. I'm going to stop bang on past. Surely that's got to be a first, guys. I'm going to stop talking. I will maybe see some of you tomorrow evening if you're able to join us. But as I say, that will be recorded. If you are coming along tomorrow night, then I will have slides and pictures and some of the documents I've been talking about. I'll be able to talk you through and show you. And my colleague Anne Fraser, who is our family historian, will be looking at how the risings had a particular impact on 3 particular families within the Highlands. So I hope you're able to either join us or catch that later on. I will be on leave next week, but the talk will go ahead. I'm going to record it this week and schedule it so it will still go out as usual on 11 AM on Thursday. I think, if I'm correct, that's the first one in 7 months that I haven't done live, so you can, I'm sure, forgive me. But I hope you can join me next week. I will be talking about stories from some of Scotland's mountains, so Ben Nevis and some other mountains, and stories that we can tell about the mountains. And note that I've swapped 2 rounds, so next week and the week after I've swapped the order round, so just to be aware of that. If there was anyone particularly looking for the tourism one next week, then it will be the week after, but as usual they will all be recorded and you'll be able to see them all. Thank you again for joining me, and I'm glad to hear that you've enjoyed it. Thank you for that. Please do fill out the survey if you are able to do so. That would be really appreciated. And a reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. That High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and that there's no payment or subscription required to take part in these events. But if you're able to donate towards our work, there's a link to be able to do so within the text of this post, and we would be very grateful if you're able to do so. Thank you so much for joining me. I'll speak to you next week, and then I'll speak with you the week after. Thank you.